Well, good morning again. I miss saying that. I feel like a stranger in a foreign land.
Good morning.
But it is good to be back in the house of the Lord. It's good to be back with you. As I look through the potential of what we could talk about this morning, I think the focus that we all have as children of God sometimes can be honed a little bit more clearly. So it's something I think we should be aware of and certainly focus on, because the stories that Jesus told as parables to the people around him reminded them of the focus that they needed to bear down on. So this morning's message I've entitled, Focus on What? It comes to us from the Gospel of Luke. We're following along in the 15th chapter, the first 10 verses, and it comes to us with two parables intertwined together. So let's take a look at them. Large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and turning to them, he said, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brother and sister, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Suppose one of you wants to build a tower, or suppose a woman has 10 silver coins and loses one. Doesn't she light a lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it? And when she finds it, she calls her friends and neighbors together and says, 'Rejoice with me, I found my lost coin.' In the same way, I tell you, there is rejoicing in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents." It is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God. We're focusing then on, focusing. We're trying to hone those skills that allow us to pick out the things that are really important to us. Because, you see, life is coming at us all the time from every different direction, isn't it? Sometimes you hear a honk from a car that's on a street outside. A ray of sunlight comes in the window that distracts your attention. Maybe you have a whiff of perfume or something cooking in the kitchen. Or maybe it's something as simple as a pinch on your toe from a new pair of shoes that seems to be just a little bit tight. Maybe it's the taste that's lingering in your mouth from a cough drop. But the world attacks us with this barrage of sensory information, and the real key to this morning's message that Jesus is telling those around him, and certainly telling us this morning, is there is a way to figure out how to pay attention to those things that are really important to us, because that barrage bombards us at all places. And so we have to figure out which ones are important and which ones we ignore. So it reminds me of a story that happened in my life several years ago, but there was an ad in one of those flyers that we get in the mail, right? And it said CVS is going to have this audiology come to their store and offer free hearing tests. So Candy, for a long time, had confronted me that my hearing was going bad. And so in good faith, I decided that I would go ahead and take one of their appointments and go have my ears checked. Did I say in good faith I was doing that? Well, the person that was coming was this doctor from the University of Florida, and that makes him good, right? Well, anyway, he comes to CVS, and back in the back by the pharmacy, there's now a little blood pressure machine sitting there. Well, they had moved all of that stuff out of the way, and they set up this little booth, right? One side was had the machine on it, and then the other three sides were glass windows so you could see in. And he invited me to open the door, go sit in the chair, close the door securely, put headphones on that were those kind that are noise deadening. And then he handed me this switch with a red button on the top. So he says, now Ken, whenever you hear anything, you push the button. And I said, fine. And he says, I'll wave to you when I'm ready. So he comes around to the side and he sits down in his chair and he's turning on his little machine. And I'm sitting there with those headphones on and I push the button. He says, we haven't started yet. He said, but I'm hearing something. And I'm pushing the button and, you hear these little sounds, beep, beep, beep.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're left, sometimes they're together, sometimes they're not.
Yes.
And I was pushing my button a lot. So when the test was over, he tapped on the window. He said, I take off my headphones and I put them on the little hook and I set the little switch down. And he says, you heard a little buzzing sometimes. It was different from the noises that my machine was making, right? I said, well, yeah. He said, that's the fluorescent light in the booth. We will give you credit for that or take away points, either one. So he takes the results and he sits there. He says, have a seat there next to your wife, and he says, let me figure this out. And I see him marking and looking and checking, and he says, I have the results from your test. And Candy goes, you can fit him with a really good pair of hearing aids, can't you? And he said without missing a beat, your husband has an acute hearing disorder. And she looked at me, she said, see, I told you. He says, we call it husband ears. It is selective hearing. Well, the reason I tell you that story is because this morning's parables are really about focusing on the things that are important. And one thing that we find is that we must be able to control the things that draw our attention. That's called selective attention. So I'm hoping that during this time where we're giving a message and receiving a message from God, that you'll use selective attention to drown out the distractions from anything that happened in our sanctuary. But of course, sometimes we don't need selective attention or husband ears or selective hearing, any of that, for us to focus on what's really important. Today is the day that 20 years ago we were all gathered around the television, and we didn't need somebody to tell us this is really important, did we? We were focused on everything that was going on the television because of the news of being attacked by terrorists. So we were able to use our ability to focus then on the things that were really important, because they were standing out way above the things that are just sometimes distracting us. So as we look at the stories that Jesus was telling us, and we try to pull all of our own experiences into this, we start to understand that there's a method that Jesus was using, and sometimes we even use it today. It's called a spotlight model. And without much success this morning, I was trying to allow the children's time to use the spotlight manner, and so here's kind of the spotlight manner. So you take a spotlight and you focus it like, can you see that? No, that's behind there. Can you see that? Okay.
Yes.
So what we're focusing on is that light is not lit. Now, it's not because the light is burned out, it's because that light would interfere with the screens. But if we're focusing on something, we're looking at that spotlight. We're not looking at the things around it because they're not quite as clear. And so that method of the spotlight method is a way that we focus on where the beam hits its target. And wasn't that the same method that the woman used looking for the coin? Didn't she first light her lamp and then start looking around and under the bed and until she finally found the coin that she was looking for? And I couldn't wait to use this, but aren't there two sides to every coin?
Yes.
For a moment, I want you to go on a little trip with me, a little mental trip with me. And I want you to go into the place where the sheep was lost. And I'm using the sheep rather than the coin because the sheep is a live thing, a tangible thing. It's not like a coin. And so you then become, in this little trip we're taking, the sheep that is lost. And I want you to look around, and as the time goes on, it seems like it's starting to get a little darker. You realize that you're in a really bad place in your life, and the day's getting longer, and you know that it's going to be dark soon. And who knows who or what will be looking for you? Now, upstage to the parable of today, you're still the sheep, but the difference is you have this wonderful relationship with the shepherd. Are you worried? No. Scared? Maybe a little bit. But you're not worried because of the relationship that you have with the shepherd. You know that the shepherd is looking out for you. And you're confident that soon you all will be rejoicing together. That's the comfort the good shepherd exudes to his flock. Jesus is the good shepherd. Believers are the flock. And well, the lost ones, well, they're lost. They're outside of the flock. They're the ones that are worried and scared. Okay, here we go again. I don't know where this came from, but when I was about 8 years old, we were in Connecticut. My grandfather had this summer home, and we always went for the summer. My dad was a college professor. We had 3 months off. We'd go to Connecticut. It was in West Cornwall, wherever that came from, and we were going up to check on the well pump, which is on the top of the mountain. And we were down a little ways from the mountain. And I know that my 2 brothers and I and my dad were going up to check on the well, and it kind of got boring because they were working on the well, and it was so beautiful. And my dad was giving us survival lessons of what do you do if you're caught out in the wild by yourself, and here's what you do, and here's how you focus. And the next thing I know, I'm the lost sheep. But I knew exactly what to do because my dad had been teaching me all these survival techniques. But it was getting later in the afternoon. It was starting to get dark, and I didn't know anything about where I was except that my grandfather's house was somewhere there. Or maybe it was, hours went by and it did start to get dark, and everybody was worried. When I finally found my way into the little community around the property there, it was kind of like a general store. There were more law enforcement cars with their lights on. They called out the National Guard. They called out, it says, you know what's in the mountains of Connecticut late at night are all kinds of animals and a young boy could get into real problems. So I walked in, and everybody was so happy to find me, and we didn't have cell phones, of course. They made a call to my grandfather's house, and we found him. Well, he found us, and right now we've treated him to an ice cream cone. So I was really in heaven, right? Everybody's happy to see me. Up comes the Jeep with my dad and my mom. Amazing. I don't think they were that happy to see me. They had their focus on a place that was different from mine. And in my focus was finding people and places that were familiar. My reward was an ice cream cone until I got home, and that was a little different story. But it is about where we put our focus and how we. If I had been focused, I'd have still been at the spring in the well pump with my family, and everything would have been fine, and I wouldn't have gotten lost. So let's shift back now a little bit distracted by things that go by us. So let's shift back to the story that Jesus was sharing. It's kind of like Evangelism 101, isn't it? Should be the first lines in the paragraph of your disciple resume. That one sheep in his story. was not one of us, was it? When we think about the characters in the story, that lost sheep was not one of us. We are the sheep in the fold. Jesus is going out of the comfort zone to find this lost sheep. So look around you and see, are all of the ones around you part of the fold, or are there lost sheep even among us? I wonder if we do as well with God's love as God does with God's love. We have this, as Christians, we have this extraordinary understanding of love. For God, we call it unconditional love, don't we? But for us, sometimes we're not so unconditional. And so there's a question in our hearts sometimes if we look around and see the extraordinary love that we have has interacted inappropriately or different. And have you sent anybody astray lately? Because our love is always less than the love that God has. God's unconditional love is what Jesus used his entire life to share with us, is this way of loving, this unconditional loving. So the question for us to take with us is that attempt at unconditional love for me even on the right track as God's unconditional love for all? Am I sending people away, or am I bringing people in? Let's go back to that spotlight example. Remember, if we look at the spotlight, there are things that are in focus and things around there that are not as in focus, not as clear. And let's add to that spotlight a lens that we can move back and forth and kind of zoom in. Because you see, Jesus took that spotlight and then the zoom lens and pulled closer people like tax collectors and sinners. And weren't there people around him that were supposed to be really good at unconditional love, but they were not happy about what Jesus was doing? They weren't understanding why Jesus would eat with sinners. They weren't understanding why Jesus would be with people that were not like them, not like us. But you see, that focus that Jesus had with that unconditional love to reach out to people who weren't there yet is central to his mission and his ministry. So what would it mean for us to practice this kind of selective attention? What would it be like for us to reach out to the ones on the fringe, the borderline people, those that are lost? Because that really doesn't happen here, does it? One of the things when we started Turning Point, we had this thought that we're going to be a little bit different. Because church is really not for church people. Church is for church people to bring others into, to get this relationship going between us, that they start to see this relationship between us and God, and then it becomes between them and God. And that's that focus that we're looking at, and that zoom lens that we can go out to the tax collectors and the sinners. And we begin that by letting go of the bitterness that comes inside of us, and we feel like God is focusing other places than us. Have you ever felt like God was looking other places than you? The Pharisees and the scribes, that was their problem. And they saw Jesus with tax collectors and sinners, the worst of the worst, right? And not with them. And they were jealous. That they wanted to be the center of focus, which is why they dressed the way they did and prayed the way they did and made rules the way they made. Typically, we want mercy for ourselves and justice for others, right? You don't have to answer that because it's not necessarily the right answer sometimes. Mercy for us and justice for them. But these parables that Jesus told tell us to celebrate when we're with sinners and tax collectors, doesn't it? God has been merciful not only to us, but God has been merciful to others. And that's what the celebration is about, as we bring them into the kingdom, into the flock, into the shepherd's fold. We kind of have to admit, though, that it really would be nice to have God just zoom in on that, with that focus and that zoom lens on us, not on those lost sheep. I mean, they're lost, right? We've already found them. We want to have God's spotlight on us, but God's selective attention is always on those who are lost. Didn't Jesus tell the shepherd who left the 99 and went and looked for the one? Didn't Jesus talk about the woman who went and looked for the one coin even though she had a basket full of coins? Jesus is always looking for the lost. And our challenge that we'll be able to rejoice with Jesus is that we celebrate the restoration of the lost. It's because we start to see God in action. We start to see God's unconditional love and unlimited grace. What is it, amazing grace? It said, once I was lost and now I'm found. I was blind and now I see. It's this attitude that is expressed in these parables told by Jesus is fundamental to the church accomplishing its goals and its mission. We're not supposed to isolate ourselves in here and then go home and be just with each other. We're supposed to go into the world so that we can interact with the lost and introduce them to Jesus. The Pharisees and the scribes, they grumbled a lot about the company that Jesus kept. God is about developing relationships. Many of those lost, many of those on the outskirts became important. Think about it. Who was the tax collector that Jesus was eating with? Matthew. Who became a disciple? Matthew. Who is it that Jesus went out of the crowd, looked up in the tree, and here's this little man up in the Zacchaeus, come down. I'm going to your house today. That's the children's song, right? He was tax collector. He was on the outskirts. You see, sisters and brothers, God calls us to be extroverts. So God calls us also to go out and be amongst the people, build new relationships. That's how the sheep are found. Be on the lookout for lost coins, lost sheep, whatever you want to call them. Those are on the fringe. I wanted to say, Jesus is dying to meet them. That Jesus died to meet them.
Yes.
That's what it's all about. Start bringing them with you when you come, because Jesus will be here and anxious to meet all of us. We like to be in the focus, and that's a way to do it. And all the children said,
Amen.